I wanted to start the conversation by, yes, this phrase, this concept that I think is pivotal to your new book, Futures of the Sun, right? And it's a term that I don't think I understand completely, the renewable center. The renewable center is this sort of space, I guess, that's supposed to be, that is imagines itself to be beyond politics, sort of post-political, or at least beyond ideology. And I got a much better sense of the concept when you talked about it recently with Mark Simpson from the University of Minnesota podcast. In that conversation, you said that there are certain dominant narratives. One, you said, is just drill, baby, drill, represented by the first and second Trump administrations, enforcing this, addiction to fossil fuels as like the substrate of all society, basically. Another, you say, is an even worse scenario, actually, maybe captured by the term fossil fascism. And then this third scenario is undetermined. It's still, a set of possibilities, shooting off madly in all directions. But, it's a potentially revolutionary space. And the thing I find so interesting about this part of the argument is, rather than trying to fill that space with something, like avow a leftist position, you're saying that you want to kind of push past left and right. That's a quote, actually, from Future of the Sun, and away from saying what that thing should look like. And so my question is basically like, what's your understanding now of the renewable center? Okay. And why was it sort of important for you to mimic almost like a nonpartisan position when it comes to trying to argue for what you might want in the world?
Okay, so I guess I should first thank you for having me on the podcast. Okay, so having said that, so renewable center, really the key word here is center. And the renewable part we'll come to in a minute. And the center, I think there's a tendency, because of this way of thinking about left and right as the key political categories, that the center is either something that the left should not move towards,
right?
Because it seems as if one is abandoning one's values. That's what it tends to mean, to shift towards center. Kind of looking at this concept and how it circulates in political discourse today. And one of the places that I found this, it's not in the book, but one of the places when I was looking for the center was actually something that Nancy Pelosi said in advance of the 2020 election. She advised the left, if you can call the Democrats the left, to shift towards the center in order to win the election.
Right.
So there's this sense that the center it's unthreatening, it's safe, it's rational, it's reasonable, it's non-ideological.
Right. Doesn't offend anybody.
Doesn't offend anybody. Yeah. We'll be talking about this term maybe again, but it's common sense. It's what, it's just what is. It's just kind of, there are these ideologues. Yeah. But if you just want to get down to the world of buying your groceries and taking the kids to hockey practice, says the Canadian, that's the center. You don't want these ideologues. The ideologues take you one place or another. Sure. So Nancy Pelosi is kind of one person. The other is Trump right after the election. He evoked the center, that this is what just happened. The center one. This place again of safety, of rationality, the place where in their case, right, people aren't woke, there aren't cultural Marxists.
Sure.
They're dangerous people, don't roam the streets, all of these typical conservative things. So there's the center. Right.
Unpolitical.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So why would the left want that? Well, I would argue that all political struggle ultimately is about trying to occupy the center. It's about trying to make your values and ideas and positions not seem like outliers and not to seem like there are other categories that you want to fight against, but to make it seem what everybody believes, what everybody takes as given. When you win politically is when you make the givenness of the world resemble the set of values and politics that you believe in. So that's what I see as the center. You don't want your ideas to seem, you don't want them to be translated into the language of another party. You don't want your you don't want your values around how people should be in relation to one another to be treated as woke.
You could say it's like, you've achieved some level of alignment with hegemony, right? Which, is this term that I think is actually increasingly sort of commonplace. It's not just rarefied as an academic concept. People understand what it means. It's like this, we don't even need to define it. We're not in a university classroom, but
That's right.
I think the interesting way that the push for a certain hegemony manifests itself right now in the climate movement sort of is by trying to advocate a strategic meeting of people where they are at. But I think it misses a lot because it's totalizing. It tends
That's
to
right.
imagine a public that is homogeneous, more or less, right? But yeah, you're trying to kind of negotiate with that. That question of political communication, I would say.
That's right.
Yeah.
So where the renewable comes in is it kind of plays off this dynamic of the center. And I was just talking about the specific political struggle around what looks like the normal, the legitimate, the obvious way in which renewables are supposed to appear on the scene. So the examples I was looking at are about different modes by which that is being played out, which might not be at all what one might hope for, which is that with renewables, the opening that renewables offers as a new mode of power, like energy, might create openings for other types of reimaginings of politics because of how significant energy is to the constitution of social, political life, infrastructurally and otherwise.
Right.
And so that's threatening. There's kind of a politics to that. I would argue it doesn't have to be, but a lot of that is geared towards the left. And there's other bodies that want to, other stakeholders, other operatives socially that want that normal of what renewable is going to be to look more like what they imagine.
Sure. It's an attempt to try and get us practically toward the kind of world of a just transition, an energy transition that's actually happening rather than only happening kind of piecemeal and in a mostly superficial way. And it's doing so, like by trying to understand the mechanisms that are at play. And I think it's trying to do more than critique. To a certain extent, in your more recent writing, you're trying actively to pivot away from that language of critique. And I've always known you to be a restless writer. You don't love the language of expose, but the way that it manifests itself in Futures of the Sun and in this new book, Power Shift, which is incredible, is by sort of, thinking honestly about the kind of almost neurobiology of change, of how behavior changes, for example, at the local level. In Futures, you talk about how the, quote, unpredictability of the new can't help but falter against the comfortable weight of the quotidian, however damaged, desperate, and unhappy a place it might be. You also say that part of the failure to date of the environmental movement to fully achieve its goals as quickly as the severity of the climate crisis demands lies in the threat posed by rapid destabilizing change. So I want to ask about, whether you hesitated to kind of concede that point, basically, because I think it's a dangerous point to just concede. But it's a point that Stéphane Labranche makes in Power Shift, that the brain is kind of a lazy organ in a way. And there does seem to be a basic antagonism in people toward accepting big changes, perhaps, that unseat or unnerve. So why do why did it feel worthwhile to take that sort of risk, to concede that point? And, where do you think how do you think the environmental movement needs to approach the question of like change, culture change, system change? All
right. I can't, first of all, I would say, I don't know what else the climate movement is other than trying to address the difficulty of that change. So Stéphane, I should say, just to kind of give a little background on him really briefly, is he has started something called the International Panel on, it doesn't translate well into English, but International Panel on Behavior Change.
Right.
It's meant to mimic the IPCC, but to add into it social scientific research and research by humanists precisely about what types of research, what types of practices are best able to get people to change their attitudes, their behaviors, their beliefs in relationship to climate. Now, I would say Stéphane and others who are associated with this group, they're not suggesting by that at all that the change should be based on the individual. It's not some kind of psychological study of like if you see a certain number of red objects, then you'll suddenly get alarmed enough to do something, and so we should put a lot of red objects in front of people. It's more this sense precisely of trying to figure out how do you get communities and individuals and governments to understand the severity of the crisis in a way, I guess I was going to say truly understand it, such that they would make changes to infrastructures, practices, protocols that are right now generating, amplifying, intensifying climate change. This, I think, is where we're really stuck. And there's a number of limitations. So one of it is certainly infrastructural. We've spent 175 years building our cities and our transportation structures, logistical chains, which we now know more about, once again, via tariffs. Those are all built around using a lot of energy. And it's difficult, even if there was a desire on the part of agencies and individuals to shift away from that. So yes, I can decide not to have a car because I live in the middle of a large city, even a city with terrible transit. I can still get around without it.
Sure. Yeah.
The vast majority of people in Canada and in many countries, increasingly more countries, don't have that option. You need a vehicle to get around, and that has nothing to do with your choice in some ways. It has to do with how the infrastructure is laid out. So there's a kind of a technological fix. The other is just that the quotidian is really a heavy, comfortable place where suddenly making big changes is both uncomfortable and not desired. So that doesn't mean that lots of people in the world have brutal things happen to them that interrupt it. War, climate crises of various kinds of things, revolutions. I mean, my family came to Canada because of the Hungarian Revolution, so that was a big break in my parents' life. Would they have wanted that? Not especially. No. They would have rather just spent their time in Hungary, living out a life and so on.
Yeah.
So I think it's that sense that there's a demand on the part of those concerned about climate. The demand is, let's make an enormous change right now that matches the severity of the crisis. And it should not surprise us that is difficult.
Right.
Climate-induced weather events. Yeah, suddenly it beats you over the head.
Yeah.
But it also kind of fades from view.
That's right. And we rebuild.
That's right.
And yeah, it's and there's perhaps again, like this is why you're on some level conceding the point. There is a little bit of a natural desire to pretend, to move on, to disguise the fact that you just went through a trauma that you didn't want, that was destabilizing, and restore something. So far, I've been a little bit unfair to the book, I think, honestly.
No, I don't think so at all. How is that unfair? How is that unfair? These are both good questions.
The hedging, the claim that you're like being nonpartisan. It's not really true of the book.
No.
That's what I mean. It does not avoid taking a position. It's a rejection of, I think, for example, the influential idea of the tragedy of the commons and the notion that like the stuff of everyday life, the air, the water, the sun should be owned. And some of the common sense assumptions that go into this like narrative of the tragedy of the commons. And I wanted to kind of maybe draw out that part of the book because, you know, you're saying that it's something we need to fundamentally oppose if we want to live in a future where the power of the sun is not throttled by capitalism and other oppressive forces. So I don't want to ask you to necessarily give a history of the idea. I thought I would quote Alfonso Giuliani on the subject, also from Power Shift. He writes that, you know, Garrett Hardin, an American biologist, popularizes this idea as a Malthusian way of looking at the issue of how natural resources and growing population pressures would inevitably bring ecosystems to crisis. And the example he gives is an open access pasture, where each individual farmer is driven to add another animal to the herd to expand their personal wealth, and then you just like overload the pasture. That's the tragedy of the commons, like in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah.
You write in Futures that attempts to turn water into property have been resisted mostly. But then you ask why the resistance to reducing, the commons to property in general isn't extended basically to energy. Why we don't think about energy in those terms. And so, yeah, I was just hoping you would talk about Hardin's idea around like human nature, the abuse of natural resources, and why we do need to reckon with its power when it comes to like rethinking energy as property.
Okay, maybe this actually goes back to the other two questions and starts to pull these all together. So this is an interesting question for that reason and for others. So the tragedy of the commons, it's often appealed to by World Bank and by the IMF and other agencies like that when they're explaining why they're making the policies that they make.
Yeah, it's just of course.
And I think there's two aspects to it, which one has to keep in mind. So one is, it's interesting that a biologist made this argument, but anyway, one is there's a presumption about human nature, and that is that human beings are fundamentally selfish.
Mhm.
And the second is that human beings can't read their own environs.
Mhm.
So they're selfish and they'll just consume everything to infinity no matter what. So,
Right.
And I guess there's a third one, which is important to what I'm going to say next, which is that private property is obviously the better way forward.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
so I'm not the first to criticize Hardin, and I'm not sure that I do that much in the book, but Ian Angus is somebody that I've talked about in a different essay about Hardin, and Angus makes a great critique of Hardin, which is a very simple one. It's that Hardin doesn't base his argument on actual fact. It's a purely speculative essay.
Right.
It's just kind of writing on the back of a napkin type of idea.
Mhm.
It's something that people might, the kind of thing that when you're stoned,
Right.
you kind of like speculate about.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
Angus would say,
that sounds credible.
yeah, Angus would say or said,
Yeah.
there's absolutely no evidence about this, that
Right.
actual people who live in communes, actual herdsmen prior to enclosure, both were not driven by their own selfishness and understood the limits of the land. Otherwise, they would have died after year one.
Mhm.
Right? They would have had their sheep. I can't believe we're talking about sheep. Eat all of the grass, and each one of them would be selfish, and they would have all died.
Right.
So, what Angus said is that Hardin, what he's describing is not herdsmen. Hardin is describing how capitalists would act.
Sure.
In a capitalist system.
Of course.
Okay, so that's very much now Hardin, though, that kind of talking stoned in a basement language has become legitimized as actual way of describing the world, which is about ownership, which is about property.
Right.
But some things escape that.
Sure.
Water is one of them, because
yeah.
it has to do something with being. It has to do something with living.
Yeah, I mean, like it sort of resolves the neoliberal formula. That's this theory. Like that's how I sort of think about it. And then things like water, especially water scarcity, water insecurity, that fuck up the formula. Like Ingrid Waldron talks about this, that there are communities that have to deal with water insecurity every single day, and they know something you don't.
Yeah.
Right. They see the environment differently.
If we see water as important to everybody,
right?
And while we're saying that, why wouldn't we make intelligent decisions about energy if it mattered to all of us and if it would be free? Like the idea would be, if you apply the Hardin, is that we would use it all endlessly to our own detriment, which is what we're doing.
That's right.
Now,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
It's not because there's a lack of private property; it's the inverse, right? And the Hardin has always been about, we have to have private property to limit what happens pre-enclosure. And it seems like it's the other way around. Anytime there's something owned publicly, I mean, in real life, it could be all messed up and so on.
Right.
But there's a different set of decision making about it for different people.
There's an opportunity for decision making.
That's right. That's right. Which right now there isn't.
There is not. And so, this actually, like, I want to jump ahead. One of the questions I was going to ask is just about growth. we have this premier, Daniel Smith, who speaks her mind. And she said recently at an event hosted by this right-wing influencer, Ben Shapiro, that growth is impossible without fossil fuels, right?
Yeah.
She said that there's an ideology that we have to hit net zero as quickly as possible, but you, quote, can't run the world on solar and wind and batteries. And so now is the time, she says, really for us to see a switch. And so Futures is pointing out that solar energy is actually a much cheaper way to sort of run the world. But that, generally speaking, capitalists are not keen to adopt it because of what you mentioned earlier, the sheer weight of the physical and social infrastructures developed over 2 centuries to exploit fossil fuels. So a lot of the work you've done by yourself and others is about this kind of impasse time, this stuckness, this interregnum that we're in, how to overcome it and so on. A big part of that is this fixed capital, these stranded assets. But
they want to make sure they're not stranded.
Of course. And it's funny, like I always think of the line in Holly Jean Buck's Ending Fossil Fuels, where she talks about how the term stranded assets is meant to maybe inspire pity. They're stranded, they're orphaned assets, right?
I like that.
You're supposed to be sympathetic to these poor assets. But you're less sympathetic, saying that the desire is to squeeze as much revenue as possible from these sites of extraction. But the jig is up, is how you also put it. It's understood now, even by the billionaire class.
Yeah, I think
the truth
by the fossil fuel companies.
By the fossil fuel companies.
I don't, and I
by
think
the
it's
leaders
being,
of our country.
I think it's
leaders of our country.
There's no hide and seek around it.
Right.
I think everybody knows what's on the table.
Yeah, the writing's on the wall. I think in terms of extreme weather events, it's just seen, again, economically, it's something we can't focus on right now, that we just can't. And that, the assumption is that resonates with people. But I think that to some extent ignores just the hierarchical top-down nature of the society and the fact that people aren't really being listened to. I, for example, took CBC's voter survey the other day, which the results are suggesting, climate is something like a 5th priority.
That's right.
If you take the survey design really funnels you toward opposing climate action. It's asking you, do you support pipelines, which people are confused right now? Do we need an east-west pipeline?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And do you support the carbon tax? Those are basically the only climate-related questions. Not do you want a safe future for your loved ones?
Right.
Whatever,
And it's very hard to read what the drama of the carbon tax is so misdone by the.
Yeah.
It's hard. I wouldn't even know what to say about that. I don't even know what the carbon tax is anymore.
For sure.
And you're right. The pipeline. How do you separate that out from anxiety around the U.S. about the necessity for a certain kind of economic, not being dependent. Exactly.
Yeah.
Now that's a very different thing that doesn't have anything to do with the environment necessarily.
Totally. It's been decoupled, environment and energy once again.
Yeah.
So, how can we contest that? I read your essay with Jennifer Wenzel really closely, talking about extraction versus extractivism, and got a lot out of understanding how extractivism has become a kind of common sense. It's really tough. Like, what's your gut feeling on where the radicalism around like liquidating and remediating fossil fuel infrastructure will come from? Is it still there waiting to be born?
Always the easy questions. Yeah, like it. So the Ben Shapiro, Daniel Smith view of things. I would have to say it's a bit like the Hardin. There are some guiding assumptions behind it that are already common sense, unfortunately. So one is that growth is good. One is that growth is just necessary. So what is the function? What a function of a society is that, and it's important to measure it in this way that is actually relatively recent to measure it in this way. GDP.
Yeah.
Perhaps even the current modes are not until post World War II. So growth is good, and fossil fuels equal growth. So those are two really big assumptions.
Can't have growth without it.
Can't. So I think it's even if you were to concede the growth is good part, the idea that growth has to come from fossil fuels is very, very iffy. And I don't think that there's any way that growth is necessarily limited to fossil fuels. And that's part of my anxiety in one of these things, that you can have You can have green
That's right.
capitalism with growth. Now,
Yeah.
there have been many papers that have shown that you can transition to a non-fossil fuel economy without it being like wacky blue skying sci-fi. So
Yeah.
a scientist that has done this repeatedly, different papers, Mark Jacobson.
Right.
There's a 20,
Stanford, right?
yeah, there's a
In multiple
2015,
jurisdictions.
that's right.
Oh,
There's a
okay, keep going.
2015 paper that shows in 139 countries,
Yeah.
each one of them it maps how by 2050 you can get to a fully renewable society
Right.
in a very, very realistic way.
Like not one size fits all either. Is the idea.
Not one size fits all. And I would say it even sticks with a pretty standard sense of how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's not saying that there's some kind of revolution in different places that pushes this along. Nor does it really suggest that you get away from growth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just suggesting that you don't need fossil fuels for growth. You can have functional societies with this other kind of energy source. So, yeah, so I don't know about that green growth thing. I do have to say that the infrastructure thing is harder, and the reason why there's such a push on the side of oil companies and I was going to say coal companies, but that's not true, natural gas companies, to make sure that their interests are the ones that are foregrounded by politicians over the environment, is because they want their money out of these very, very expensive projects. So the stat that I have heard about the tar sands in Canada, so one site of extraction, a big one, and a capital intensive one, increasingly less so because of new technologies, is that by 2050, it will have cost more than, just in infrastructure, more than $500 billion. So I looked this one up. This is not in my head. That's the GDP of Ireland, right? That's the GDP of Ireland.
I see, yeah.
That part I looked up. So it's an incredible amount of money. And if you're a capitalist enterprise, to have that suddenly turned off is a shocking loss that both the companies behind it, but then all of the stockholders, all of the stakeholders just don't want to have happen. So that's kind of what stands in the way. That there's that infrastructural stuckness. There's the stuckness that comes from capitalism. Some of the other stuckness maybe comes from the easy way that Danielle Smith or Ben Shapiro can prod a fiction into reality anytime they want, right? Which is to say, my God, how could you do this? That doesn't lend itself to growth. And they don't even have to say growth is good or growth is necessary. It's just that's growth. We need that.
Yeah, that's the common sense thing, right? And it does strike us as characteristically American and accelerationist in certain ways. But the thing that I find a little flummoxing about Future of the Sun is that, it does also scrutinize in a balanced almost way the entrepreneurs who are presenting themselves as saviors also, right? Not just the bad guys, not just the people who are kind of like, what are you, triggered? Like those folks that are just kind of, anti-woke and doubling down. You're also kind of going after folks like Bill Gates, who are, spouting the same kinds of rhetorics in just like a different dress, a different costume. And yeah, I think like we are in this moment. It's true. And what I guess I'll say, what I find flummoxing about it is just that, if we want change and we're sold the notion that perhaps common sense is a useful and powerful position, that seems to be the friendly way that energy transition, clean energy can come into being, right? It's this like kind of incremental, gradual change that maybe people will accept, And so, yeah, EVs are greenwashing, and absolutely the companies that own the renewable infrastructure are going to charge a premium for you to obtain it. The retrofits that you're going to buy are going to be a luxury rather than a necessity. But that's better than nothing. Like, it's like we don't want that to fracture either. We don't want to lose that. So I think, the philanthro capitalist can throw their weight around. How do we get to this point? where philanthrocapitalism is quite popular. It does feel, at least not everywhere, but it does feel like it's the safe way forward. And what's wrong with it?
Okay. Yeah. I have a lot to say about this, especially in the wake of the recent election. Well, I just kind of want to maybe take a little bit of time to position why I talk about the philanthrocapitalists in contradistinction to actions of government. So what the book is about a little bit is about narrative. Well, not a little bit. It's about the narratives being sold by different actors about their capacity to do the right kind of climate action as a way to get you on board a project of transition on their terms. So the first chapter is about the way that the nation state, particularly in the West, has been selling itself as the right actor. And the second chapter is about the way in which the business community has been doing it. Now, the really big thing in each of these is about having the capacity to do things on scale and with the speed needed. So that's the key. That's the key. So the state says, and I think a lot of people on the left believe that the state can do this, and that's why you have to tarry with them to try to make this happen. And you have nothing else like that can work on the horizon of a decade, 2 decades or something. Then there's this other group. The way that the business community and especially the tech community has used its capacity, it has used that via Musk to say that the government is ineffective.
To take a chainsaw to the government.
That's right. It's bureaucratic. It doesn't do the kinds of things that we can do. The government could never make an iPhone. Okay.
So there's this presumed social license.
That's right. So that's one thing. That's exactly it. Kind of like, this is the time to act.
Yeah.
If you want to get to Mars, the government's not going to do it. Maybe it could. Maybe it could at one moment.
Another time.
Another time. This is not the moment for that.
That's right.
Okay. So Musk doesn't really care about the environment. We can talk about that in a minute as well. But there's another part to that which will get us to the philanthrocapitalist, and this is not how I would have talked about this when I first did the book, but I'm going to use this as the way into that. And this is something that the venture capitalist Mark Andreessen, often seen as kind of like the intellectual of the tech crowd, the person that puts forward their vision of things, the I don't know if you know this Techno-Optimist Manifesto.
Yeah.
Okay, so laying out what it is that they actually think.
Yeah.
So Andreessen made his name as the founder of Mosaic and Netscape, then invested in a bunch of things. Incredibly wealthy, now runs this venture capitalist firm called Andreessen Horowitz. Very well known for his blog that he puts up on his website where he pontificates about various kinds of things. And what Andreessen was saying is, listen, you're going against this deal that we had. And now you need to back off and let us do our thing, and then we'll become moral actors later on.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I think the Gates Foundation is the one that's most well known as a big philanthrocapitalist agency, but every one of these guys, these tech people, has their own philanthropy. So Zuckerberg and his wife have one. Bezos has set one up, etc. Musk has set one up. That one's a particular disaster. All right, so
it's on brand.
That's right. And all of them, there's this kind of sense that, look, we're fulfilling the deal. I think there's at least this is part of the fantasy. And we'll give you get a double bonus. We give you things really quickly in terms of technology, which matters to you more than anything. It's going to make society go forward. It's what progress is about. And then we'll manage your social problems via our philanthropies. Okay, so here are the problems with that. Maybe everybody can already read into this. So one is
anyway, something's not right.
One is kind of like as you're doing your thing, so we're waiting for you. We're waiting for you to do your part of the deal. Well, in a lot of fields, what you're doing is, if we're kind of bringing this back to the environment, what you're doing while you're a business actor is really fucking up the environment. Okay,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times in my work on energy I've come into contact at some point with a former tar sands executive who's retired and now has some kind of little NGO or advocacy group where he's it's always a he, by the way, advocating for the environment.
Right.
And I don't even know what to say to these people because they can somehow
absolve you of your sins.
They just feel like they can do that switch. Maybe they're trying to absolve themselves. But there is that sense of the deal. Now is the time to do my moral part, and the other part was there. So
I'm buying an offset.
That's right. Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So that's one problem. The other thing is these capitalists, these philanthropies are really about avoiding taxation.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're about. They're about providing money to your heirs. They're about making sure the government doesn't take stuff from you.
Right.
They're about putting your money to work in some kind of way, and it's about not getting taxed.
Yeah, and you get to still present yourself as a self-sacrificing hero.
That's right.
It's a perfect scenario.
And like the last two things I'll just say is that the real problem of this is decision making. Mm-hmm. Unlike what a government might do with the money, if they tax these people, you don't get to decide what they do with it, where they put their money, how they spend it, and for the most part, none of these philanthropies from these very wealthy people have focused on climate. The one exception is Gates, and that's why I looked at Gates. Yeah. And even if one were to want to celebrate some of what he's done, and that's a conditional, I want to just say one other thing about it, and I'll stop this long answer. You still would not be able to decide what he was doing and why he was doing it. And the Gates Foundation has been known to step all over governments for all kinds of things, starting with their health missions, but also with
talking about foreign governments. We're talking about
foreign governments,
countries that go into and
that's right.
We haven't figured out. We're going to cure this. We're going to.
So when it comes to climate, the kinds of things that interest Gates are geoengineering.
Yeah, that's right.
Tech, things that do IP. He treats it like in his account of this as he's like a venture capitalist. So he'll try this out. Maybe this is a way to make concrete less CO2. And his whole thing is
market viable.
That's right. And he just treats this all as I'm not the government. I'm doing this efficiently, and I don't have any ideology around it. And the guy probably believes it. Mm-hmm. He's whatever.
He's in rare air.
He's in rare air.
He imagines himself, I think, as sort of almost a pure intellectual in some ways,
Yeah. So I mean, if this is our option, if there's limits on the state, if we've seen that nation states don't seem to be able to work as effectively as they might or need to, and so then there's this sense, I think, a very powerful sense, a very common sense, then that the business community is the better one. I'm saying common, not on the part of academics, but on just kind of a general social vibe. They get things done
for sure,
and they're not going to. There's very little business around climate, so you have to be philanthropic.
That's right.
Well, that's not a great option when not many of them have done it, and when we don't get to decide what they do.
Yeah, and then we collapse into easily the preferred language that Gates wants us to use, which is that clean energy is a green premium product.
That's right.
Something. A different way of thinking about it is the one that you're proffering in the book, which is that it's an energy commons. Actually, that there is an energy commons, if we want. That's not something people perhaps can tangibly see right now. You acknowledge that. It is a kind of a global yet place-specific project that you'd like to see come into being, and that I'd very much like to see coming into being. I think it would be socially transformative, but what we have is this idea that the market is an organ. It's like this living thing that exists outside of human decision making, almost.
Yeah.
But
And is the most effective mechanism of decision making.
Yeah. If not the only one, absolutely the most effective one.
Yeah.
But there's also this problem of the nation, and I think like that's maybe where we should land, because we're also in Canada in this moment of this resurgent nationalism that is taking on strange manifestations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I want to quote though Cindy Woodhouse, who brings some sanity to the conversation. This is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. She said recently that Canada will not defeat Trump's colonialism with more colonialism.
That seems right to
in
me.
our country. And you're just attacking nationalism for the most part as a dead end, saying that it's hard to imagine any significant action on climate change that doesn't involve decisions made by nations, but that this is little more than a ruse, basically, because I think you say, these are networks of global power demarcated by property and ownership and animated by a history of violence and colonialism. So, you're not giving us the nation as an out. You're not saying that we, like, Seth Klein in A Good War, saying that we need to like claim and change the state, resuscitate it for something good. You say that, we got to divorce ourselves from that notion as an out. So what signs do you see of that coming into form? Do you see that anywhere? Is it just we just step into it? We just imagine otherwise?
Well,
what about this moment? Elbows up and the kind of
interesting
fighting spirit,
So let's just say, if one was to take my criticism of nationalism on the one hand, nation state on the other, those are different projects, perhaps. If one was to take it simply as a political rhetoric, it would go as follows. So I don't have a project, but I'm saying don't put all your eggs in this basket. There are limitations to this. The limitations are what Cindy Woodhouse has said. This is not a particularly good political form, the nation state. Maybe you have to hold your nose and think it's going to do certain kinds of things for you. I'm not sure it will ever accomplish what you want from it. If we are to put our faith in the nation as the actor, and nationalism is maybe what propels the project of committing to the nation, a kind of an eco-nationalism, I just have one easy comeback to whether that would work or not, and that is that it has not worked to date. There has been a long period of time now when the environmental and climate crisis has been front and center, and where nations have made the decision to act on it. They know what they have to do under the terms of the Paris Agreement. Like, the major producers aren't doing anything. The ones that are doing something aren't doing enough and are very small. Like, so Denmark and Netherlands, I think, together do 0.4, 0.5% of greenhouse gases. So the ones that are doing very, very well are just not doing the level of things they should be doing. Even they are not doing what they should be doing. And so we can't really count on them. And I guess there's two other things I would say about the nation state. We should talk about elbows up too. I won't go on too long. But the nation state is always going to be the issue of a free rider problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks for bringing this up.
So it's really hard for me to do this, and so others will do it. There are rationales that I can bring to the table for why we don't have to do anything, and so others have to do it. Guyana has come, is counting its blessings about having discovered oil in large quantities. It's a very poor country. It needs the resources. It wants life to be better there. It wants people to flourish in a way they haven't before. And the president, I think it is, I'm not sure, president or prime minister, has been quite explicit in saying, yeah, we are going to do this project of oil extraction. We get what it does, but the rest of you can do that other stuff, the greenhouse gas stuff, while we focus on this. Now, there's an incredibly complicated set of issues around just transitions and energy justice, so on, that we could talk about that are part of that, but there's other kinds of free riders in there as well. I think Canada has been a bit of a free rider on these things as well.
Yeah,
they can hide behind a kind of a moral. And then the last thing I'll say about the nation is there's this essay by Hannah Knox called Footprints in the City, I think it is. And she does something that I found really fascinating, that I learned an enormous amount from. And what she talks about is, well, I read it this way at least. She talks about what states are good at, like what a nation state is good at. And she says that nation states are, they're objects, the modern nation state, of governmentality. They manage populations, they generate stats around them, they try to figure out what to do various kinds of things with them. Oh, there's this many people get sick, we better do this, we better generate, we're going to decide who's healthy, who's not.
It's all of the standard talking about in Revenge of the Real as well.
All of the standard kind of
filter into the nation state. As people.
So, but she suggests that there's no population that fits the population of climate change. She calls this population, because it's a planetary population. And when it comes to how a nation state would come to it to try to governmentalize it, it's empty. There's no category.
It's unsorted. They can't see it.
It's too big for the state. Like everybody, if you're going to be serious about it, you have to act like your citizens are analogous to everybody else. You have to try to act as if they were the planet. You can't act on the whole planet. But there's no apparatus for doing that. That's not how the nation state got developed. That's not how a modern state developed. It's not going to act in a way that speaks to the necessity of the whole planet.
I hear you. You know.
So do I have an answer to that?
I think so. Well,
you're
saying it still. You're telling us the truth, I think, which is that we are still going off a cliff. Actually, that relying on the nation state, like, you're not responsibilizing the state. What would that mean? You're not saying it won't do it. You're saying it can't. You're saying it can't do it.
I think it currently
constructed.
Yes, I think it's currently constructed.
Do it. Yeah. So I mean, you can't fault a structure for not falling in line, which is not perhaps the easiest narrative to sell, but the right one, I think. And so the thing you're wrestling with in the book, and the thing I really appreciate about it, is that you're attempting to not give us shortcuts, actually. That ultimately is because these podcast questions, they're looking a little bit, they're styled a little bit on the model of like a TED Talk.
Yeah, well, I have a three-pointer about what I'm going to do.
They're often that, right?
I'm very sensitive about
It's nice when a movie just decides not to end.
I think it's, I think I even say in the last chapter that I refused the genre. Because it was a series of lectures, and the genre would be, okay, smart guy, you've had all these criticisms. What's the way forward?
Yeah.
And I don't do that, but I do try to. But I don't just say, mic drop. Good luck, see you guys.
Yeah.
It's to say that it's better to understand the conditions we're in, and to then start to develop a politics around that. And there are politics being developed around that already. I'm not going to develop it. That's just like the state doesn't do certain things. My role as a critic is not to kind of do a checklist at the end of the things that I think are the things to do. I think there are organizations, and I think there are movements like Fridays for the Future that are doing certain types of work of which I see are essential. And so if I'm not having faith in the nation, I do think there has to be a extra national climate movement that exists. It doesn't have
sovereignty. It doesn't have deep decision-making powers at the level of the state. But maybe that's where there has to be that kind of effort and that power in some level. Is that wish fulfillment? Is that like dreaming and a desire?
I think that's okay, but it is dreaming.
I think I'd rather keep a politics of that kind of internationalism alive than think, well, what have we been talking about here? We put our faith over into technology. We hold our nose in these political structures like nation states are the right ones to go with, and we just aren't not the only ones to go with. So we might as well go with them. I don't know, like the worst possible. I'm not saying people listening to this would do this, but some other people have done this. Like eco-fascisms are the right way.
Right. Whatever you have to do.
Whatever you have to do. I think this is still remains a really tough set of choices and politics for all the reasons that you've been suggesting, for the difficulty of communicating correctly about climate change, for a communication that affects behavior change, which I'm not sure communication ever really does in quite the way we imagine it, to remapping the quotidian in a way that doesn't feel threatening, to making something happen out of a climate disaster. Caleb Wellham and I were recently talking to Andreas Malm, and he pointed out that he found it limiting and disturbing that the citizens in Valencia, city that was deeply damaged by flooding, protested against the government. Okay, strange. And he's saying, well, okay, that's great, but what you should be protesting against is Repsol, the Spanish company,
right,
that is the oil company of Spain, that is the one that's generating these problems to begin with, right? So it's kind of like all of this is about where do we put our efforts and energies, and where do we perhaps not put that same energy, because we only have so much capacity politically, and there's so many struggles to take on.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, there's lots more that we could talk about, and I'll just say on that last example from Mom that, I mean, it's understandable that a group of people, the same thing happened in LA after the wildfires, right? The head of the fire department was fired because they didn't deploy enough engines to, quell the fires before they got really out of hand. That's fine. You fire a few people, but the structure doesn't change at all. And it's lunacy to imagine that endless adaptation and a more proactive government would have saved some infrastructure and some lives. So it makes sense to responsibilize the government for that. But it does make more sense on a deeper level to attack the, craven fossil fuel interests that are incinerating the planet. I sympathize with that sort of desire for, attacking the people who, are deserving of blame. But one of the things you talked about in our first interview was how it's very difficult to even sort of blame and shame those actors. These are non-state actors. It doesn't make sense politically. It doesn't have a common sense feel for us to blame and shame, protest, and so on. When it comes to, it's a complicated thing strategically. And Aster Taylor, when she was here talking about her book, Age of Insecurity, mentioned that, for her, a protest is good, but she'd rather have 1,000 really committed people building an organization than 100,000 people taking up, public space for a few days. And I think that's a little bit where my head is at.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks so much.
I'll say one other thing. Elbows up. One other thing about elbows up. Elbows up does not seem to have done much for the climate in Canada.
Not so much.
In fact, it's the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. Elbows up for climate.
Elbows up means you're being asked about pipelines and the carbon tax.
That's right. And just made to feel good. And that is a thing you acknowledge too in Futures, is that the nature, you say, sutures together beliefs and identities and creates, a certain feeling of common purpose. But elbows up, it just underscores the fact that it often does not have much content.
Yeah.
I mean, thanks, Imre.
All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah.